Hello, this is Arjun Kwasnikov again, and welcome to part 7 of Delzhi in 44 letters. If this is your first time watching any of these, welcome, thank you very much. And if you want to know a bit more about the descriptions of what this project is, I would recommend looking at some of the previous videos that I've saved on my playlist. So let's start into what I have for this video. So before I actually go into talking about the letter form itself of the seventh letter, I want to talk a little bit more about some broader concepts. And in addition to my work as a fine artist, I'm also an interpretive guide, specifically a cultural interpretive guide, which is just somebody who helps clients who may be institutions or businesses that are looking for some verifiable source of cultural knowledge from a local native people. And so I only do that work within my own tribe's territory, which is the Ninilchik tribe, which is also called the Nichił Nation, Nichił being a word for our distinct culture and lineage. So when I'm doing that kind of work, I frequently engage in these two words here, which I've written: de-romanticizing and disappointment. And even though those sound a little bit sad and negative, and they definitely are, I think they're important because they help do a lot of unraveling of what people's preconceived notions of an indigenous or native culture is, which happens even with people who are familiar with other indigenous cultures. It just emphasizes the idea that we are all distinct and different, and we're all deserving of our own separate acknowledgement, and that's one of the things I care very much about. And the reason it's a disappointment is because when in questions and briefs I'm given, I often give non-answers, and those answers are when somebody asks something that comes from a preconceived notion or romanticized version of something. And when I say romanticized version, I don't necessarily mean romance, the love story of two people. That's a very small part of the definition of what romance is. And in this case, in cultural study, it means the idea that people have of a culture or a place that is, it's almost dreamlike. And that's why I've written this person dreaming here of being connected to nature and all these various animals, and there's somebody with a feather in their head. And that's the romanticized version that a lot of people have of native cultures in this part of the world. Also, a side note, there's a psychological phenomenon known as Paris syndrome, which started mostly in Japan because many tourists from Japan were documented as having this type of reaction of depression and a disappointment when they visit Paris for the first time, because instead of the idealized version that they see and hear in literature and books and TV, they see that Paris is this very busy city that is full of energy and things that are not pretty to look at, and bad things, just like any other place in the world. And I've been to Paris before, and yeah, there are parts of it that it's just a city. There's parts of it that are just a city. And so there's been some psychologists in Japan that coined that Paris syndrome. So this is a little bit similar to that, in which there's somebody here, like this lady, who's asking me about quote unquote native things. And I'm just doing a caricature. I don't mean to offend anybody in particular, or this is just like a generalized person. And so I have to disappoint them when I give them information that's de-romanticizing their point of view. But even though that happens, and they can see that maybe we don't have the things that people think a native culture should have, or we do things that are not only not quote unquote native, but also like what other people around the world do, it is a bit disappointing. And even though that's a bit sad sometimes, for me, I see it as giving an opportunity for existence and being seen, being rooted in reality, and all of the wonderful things that come with being able to start off on a fresh note, and just to have that be a beginning, not an end. And so that's why, even though it feels like I'm a bit of a bad cop at times doing interpretive work, I see it as for the greater good, as being out there and embracing what I am and who I know I am and who I know my people are, and making that known and saying that it may not be this idealized way that's very natural and mythical, so to speak, but it is still valid and important, and it has its own type of beauty. And one of the things that I get asked frequently about is animals. And in my own fine art and in my own work, I rarely use animals as a theme or a motif. And that's because of some of this work doing de-romanticizing, because animals play a big role in that. People tend to equivocate animals in native culture with very big spiritual ideas, or totems is a big one. And that's an interesting thing, because here totem poles aren't a part of our culture, but they're part of cultures that are hundreds of miles away. But you still see some of them once in a while here, because somebody will put one up, because that's what people think of when they think of Alaska. They think that totem poles are everywhere, but they're not part of our culture. So when you see one, it's probably not from anything here. It's either one that they've just bought and put up to look like it's the romanticized version of Alaska, or it might actually be somebody from one of the totem cultures who happens to live here, and they wanted to put one up in their house. And so unless you know for a fact, you can pretty much guess that it's a bit out of place. So when people ask me a question, like, let's imagine this caricature lady who says, "What's the most important animal in your culture?" I would start with the mouse. And the reason for the mouse is it's seemingly an insignificant animal. They're universally known. They're not anything special that's only located here. Everybody has mice everywhere around the world. And mice and rats and rodents, and they're considered a kind of vermin and a pest. But they're still important. They're part of the ecology. They're part of the world. They do their own thing. They work. And one of the fable-like stories that I like, that has been recorded by a few people in the region, involves a mouse and a bear. And it's similar to that. I'm not sure if it was an Aesop fable, but the mouse and the lion, where the bear is walking on a trail in a certain way to avoid where a mouse lives, and the other animals or people, I forget who it is, ask the bear, "Why are you avoiding them where the mouse lives? You're walking such an uncomfortable thing to get out of the way." And the bear says, "Because the mouse is important." And so in the story, the bear already knows that the mouse is important. And the lesson is the other people or animals watching when something happens and the mouse clears something out of a path for the bear. And the bear either fights off something attacking the mouse or something like that. And then people understand that that's a relationship between an animal who's a very big animal that has a big footprint, literally and figuratively in biology, with a very small animal that's seemingly insignificant. And unless people can really adjust to the idea that yes, you can and should elevate the mouse to that level of mythologizing, very similar to a Buddhist concept in a way, then you might not be able to fully understand what the concepts of all the other animals that are part of the romantic scheme of things. And for me, based on my knowledge and interpretation, animals are a bit like actors. They represent archetypes and roles, and when they're involved in a story or something, they're not like otherworldly beings or gods. They're also just like people. The animal world is similar to the people world. They're just we don't communicate between each other very well, but we still all rely on each other. We're still subjects of the same forces of the world and universe. And so it's a bit like having this hyper reflection of all these different creatures emphasizing different characteristics and qualities. And those stories and fables are ways to encode lessons, and they're forms of entertainment, and people tend to forget that. So when they hear a story about an animal, they think, oh, that's so beautiful, it's wonderful, it's inspirational. It's like, well, maybe for you now, but maybe for a relative or ancestor back then, that was just their TV. That was not, it was not something to find constant inspiration from and aspire to be. So I'm already kind of nearing 10 minutes, so I'm going to go right into drawing this letter, which is the letter D. You've seen it drawn here. It looks a bit like a mouse ear and a sharp little mouse face. That's exactly what it is. And it makes the DL sound. It's written with DL in Latin letters. And we do have this sound in English, and we do have it written in English, but it's not pronounced the same all the time. So let's draw the letter first. Big mouse ear, kind of in the top center, going down to make a little sharp mouse face, and a line coming back up. And lowercase is just the most of the loop in a hook, and that first line going down the right. This brush is a little bit rough, so I'm going to change brushes really quickly. Let's screw it up here. A little line down there. I'll do it again for scale. So that's capital letter D and small letter D. And D comes from the word Dlina, which is a word for mouse, and it's actually from a dialect in the West. It's not necessarily local here, although there are many words for different mice and rodents. But I wanted to use this one specifically because it follows the principle of acrophony. And acrophony means having letters or symbols that are made to represent a word or a sound that starts with that particular letter or sound. And because Dli starts the word Lina, I chose to use that. And we can also find it in this word, Tazlen, which is just a word I happen to like in Dena'ina a lot. It means a fast-moving current. And over here in English, I've written paddle, waddle, and muddle because the second syllable is that same Dli sound, except we happen to spell it D-D-L-E, even though we don't say paddadale, waddadale, muddadale. And we actually do have DLs in other words, like padlock and ad-lib, but they are between syllables. So it's padlock, ad-lib. It's not dl. So that's an example of where it matches, but it doesn't match. And another example of why writing is not the same. And going back to de-romanticizing briefly, I wrote over here, which looks like it might be a Dena'ina sentence, but in fact is just English. It's just using the Delzhi letters to write English, similar to how Latin letters are sometimes used to write Dena'ina. And it just says, we just speak English. And that's another question I get asked a lot. What's your native language? And if somebody were to ask me that, or a kid, or anybody from here, they would tilt their head and look at you and go, English? What are you even talking about? They're not going to instinctively know that they're talking about, that person's asking about a cultural language. And so a better question for this person who might think, oh, it's so sad you don't speak your native language anymore. You have to remember, well, if we never spoke it, it was never our native language. So even though it's a source of legacy and culture and information, and we still have some tacit ownership of it, let's flip that question around. What makes this person and their culture own English? If they can deduce that we have lost ours, what makes them think that they have theirs? And that is a really interesting question to think about. And before the end of this video, I want to look at this hieroglyphic pill. And that is, it's just people watch the video Thoth's Pill, which my wonderful friend Josh at the channel Native Lang made years ago, which was one of the big inspirations of making this whole system and really working it out in the first place. And I want to just thank him again. Well, that's all for part 7, and I hope to see you for more. Thank you very much.